Hi everyone. Thank you all so much for coming to our last Reimagining Urban Planning series. This has been a series we started back in April. This is the last one, so we're here. We took a break in November to kind of give some space and some time to process the results from the elections, and now we've arrived to this version of the multiverse. I'm a big sci-fi and comic fan, so I'm always thinking about the different iterations and multiverses that we all live. Um, of course, the song that I just added is Two Hands to Heaven from Beyonce's Cowboy Carter. It started off as a joke, but everyone knows that I start every meeting that I facilitate with a Beyonce song. And our options today were Two Hands to Heaven, but I almost gave y'all Cater to You by Destiny's Child. And I was like, wait, that's a different mood. So I had to stop it. Thank you all again for coming. My name is Richard Aviles. We are people from all over the world. Yes, amazing. Okay, cool. We're here. Sorry, last time we had an issue where the license didn't kind of something happened and we had to cap it at 300 people. I see there's 302 now, so we're not capped. So that's exciting. Again, thank you all for coming. We have people from all over the US, so shout out to all of you. I also saw folks from Pakistan, and I also saw folks in Puerto Rico and in Colombia and other parts of Latin America and Europe. So welcome. Thank you all for being here. Again, like I mentioned before, the Reimagining Urban Planning series is really a pilot project in our radical imagination work that is starting at the Institute in January. You'll hear more about that at the end of the series. And really, it's an attempt for us to be critical and to think about the way that urban planners have been trained in the role of urban planning in the worlds that we're living in, particularly now more than ever, they're important. And over the last seminars, we've explored different themes and different topics within urban planning. We had one on arts and culture. We've talked about belonging. We've talked about urban planning and its relationship to economics. We've talked about urban planning and its relationship to land. And today we are arriving to this last seminar that we are titled Planning for Dystopian Futures. And dystopia is in parentheses because, there's much to say about dystopias and whether we're in them or not. I'll get started with the introductory descent. Again, these are just sort of reflections that we've been having within the team, and then I'll introduce our speakers for today, and then we'll come into a conversation right after. So with that being said, let's just jump into it. Here we go. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to participate in the National Organization for Youth Safety NOYS, y'all should definitely go follow NOYS, at their annual National Youth Transportation Equity Conference in Denver. One of those days, we were sitting outside of the hotel, and I noticed an intersection in front of the hotel. And of course, as the transportation planning nerd that I am, saw all of its potential conflicts. The striping was bad, the signaling wasn't clear, and there were no interventions that would prioritize pedestrian safety. Girl, there were no pedestrian push buttons, nothing. We jokingly, me and the friends that I was with, started proposing all the interventions that would better the intersection. Later that evening, other conference participants and myself, we were having dinner while outside of the hotel, and all of a sudden we witnessed what could have been a tragic car crash. No one was injured, but both parties, the vehicle driver and a motorcyclist, were visibly angry and started throwing punches. I couldn't sit back and do nothing. A part of me hoped that other people would have noticed and taken the initiative to stop them, and instead, people were watching and others were blatantly spectating and recording the situation. Everybody brought out phones. In that instant, I realized that this was the bystander effect at full force, and I was not okay with that. Given the current state of the world, and of course, also being mindful of my own queerness and what the situation could escalate into if I threw myself into a sea of hypermasculinity, I had to assess what I had the capacity for. So I started yelling at them, and I mean yelling. I was telling them that it wasn't their fault, that the intersection was shitty. I was reminding them that they were both okay, no one was hurt, and they could have just turned around and leave. It was my way of trying to do some de-escalation work. And listen, they stopped. They got some punches in, but ultimately they stopped, and I just couldn't leave it to a queer femme to do the work. I share this story only because it was after this moment that I realized that the dystopia is here. At what point did we normalize being spectators of violence? When did the bystander effect become our MO? Witnessing everyone around me pull out their phones and deter from intervening just made me wonder if we as a society had abandoned care and concern as part of our human design. And just because we may not be experiencing it, some of our communities, both locally and globally, are living within dystopias. I can't help but wonder if our comfort is only available to us at the expense of others' dignity and humanity. Is that the dystopia? Throughout the tenure of the series, the central underlying questions have always been what constitutes urban planning and what is the role of the urban planner in this new era we're entering? And I have to add, who is an urban planner? Because the truth is that these days it's grassroots neighborhood groups, nonprofits, consultants, local elected officials, and others who are operating as planners. We must acknowledge the fact that the challenge we now face requires a broad and deep level of engagement. And this is a strength, but it also requires better models of co-creation in collaboration. Now that we arrived at the end of the series, it is clear that we must prioritize, invest, advocate for, and practice radical imagination. In our seminar on advocacy and urban planning, the need to have planners become more creative, more audacious, and more radical was the central theme of the seminar. That sentiment is truer now more than ever. So the question begs, what do we need as planners, professionally and personally, in order to feel empowered to be creative, audacious, and radical? Personally, it is my belief that what we need as planners is to take a moment and ask ourselves, who are we committed to? If you've attended some of the seminars, y'all know I say this all the time. Oh yeah, look, I wrote it. Like I mentioned in previous seminars, we as urban planners do not function outside of the space-time continuum, though we have been trained to think otherwise. We don't enter communities without our own implicit biases and privileges. Being mindful of where our positionality lies within systems of power is important, which by far is the hardest part of the work. To then be willing to leverage that power in the name of community autonomy and leadership. Under this new administration, it will be a difficult task to carry that out within institutional spaces of governance. And on the flip side, this election has also revealed that the government has failed voters and voters are ready to blow it up, which is valid. This means there's an opportunity for urban planning to deliver real solutions and show what it looks like when the government is responsive, effective, and equitable. As a result, I encourage you to look within the colleagues present here today. Y'all know the chat goes off. Y'all be saying hi to each other, sending emails, posting RFPs. Y'all be doing the most in the chat, and I love it. So I encourage you to look to those who are here today. And there's something that we've learned throughout this series is that there is a hunger for community building amongst other planners that are in alignment with the values we try to uplift throughout the series. Professionally, well, that's another story. There is a possibility that our work will be very difficult, especially for those of us that are working to design cities that are more equitable and can atone for the harm that the legacy of the field has enacted on communities of color. That being said, it is important that we find ways to jump loopholes and in some cases even code switch. We must advocate for curricula that includes writing and theories from practitioners with lived experience. We must also train incoming planners with the skills necessary to better advocate for communities, understand the unintended consequences of our designs, and be willing to humbly be of service to the communities we work with. It is important to use this opportunity to reflect upon what got us here in the first place. What were the drivers and aspirations for the millions of people that voted the way that they did? Have we really been listening? And let me first make myself very clear. I was trained to organize desde, sin, y contra el Estado, within, without, and against the state. I will always organize in all three ways. And that being said, the state, which also could be called the institution, still plays a role in the current world we live in. The state holds resources, funding, and some argue that even capacity. We have to leverage the institution, and to be honest, we might have to do it discreetly. It's imperative to recognize that planning happens also at a community level and informally. These informal spaces have also thrived because there has been no space for them within institutions. They were organized without the state. Now, let me also be very clear. I'm not asking for us to co-opt these informal spaces, but rather I'm asking that we make space and give leadership to those who are shepherding their land and fostering the communities that live within them. As we come to the end of the series, all I can say is thank you. Thank you for your questions, your presence, and your consistency. The future is uncertain, so now more than ever, we need to accept that and find ways to stay sane and be willing to transform ourselves and find the motivation to continue the work. As we move forward, we will commit to finding ways to continue this work and be in community with you all. I hope that you leave this seminar feeling inspired, seen, curious, and encouraged to reimagine the way we practice our profession, and more importantly, reimagine the role of urban planning in this new world. Early next year, we will be launching a new series that we hope you'll join us. It's a Just Transition Design Lab. We will focus on the ways that we can create space to learn, imagine, and plan projects and strategies for a just economy, for a just transition of the economy from one that is extractive and unjust to one where all people and ecosystems we rely on can thrive. So I will be sending more information on that. And with that being said, that was the last introductory defense. I hope you enjoyed it. With that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Connie. Connie Raza is the Executive Director of Future Current, formerly Social and Economic Justice Leader Project, a movement utility that provides progressive leader space to plan along a longer time horizon that they otherwise are able to prepare to meet conditions beyond our control, and to practice responding to crisis and opportunity across organizational lines. Before joining Future Current, Connie built the Strategic Research Department and served as Chief of Campaigns at the Center for Popular Democracy. She currently sits on the boards of the Action Network Fund, the Economic Policy Institute Policy Center, and the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, and chairs the board for the Global Fund for a New Economy. Connie, what an honor to have you. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much. And what an honor it is to be here. And thank you for your provocation as well. Um, our focus at Future Currents is really to support movement leaders and organizations to build the will, capacity, and strategy to win the just and joyful future we deserve. And this year we spent really 10 months working with over 300 organizations and over 800 leaders doing scenario planning for what governing 2025 and 2026 could look like. And so part of my excitement about joining you today is that we spend a lot of our time helping organizers and advocates push their time horizons further into the future. And in so many ways, urban planning already implicitly looks forward that way. And so I am going to start with an invitation to slightly reframe the session. As Richard said, the dystopia is here. And so, to my mind, the critical task for all of us, but certainly for urban planners, is to plan for the beautiful future. And that's really my call to action today, is to design the next thing and the thing that we mean to be living into. In January, we're going to enter a period of true authoritarianism at the federal level. And I'm understanding authoritarianism as an anti-democratic system of governance characterized by anti-plurality and by the concentration and centralization of power in the hands of one leader or political party. And it's important to note, and some of these folks are already on the call, but people have been living under authoritarianism in the United States in many states. They've been living in laboratories for testing out authoritarian approaches. And so we have some experience. And one of the things that we can really learn is let's not design for that future, but plan through that future. I'm going to take you on a slight detour, which is I moved to New Haven, where I'm sitting right now, during the aughts. And because it's actually relevant, I moved to New Haven without a connection to Yale. And it's a really different experience of this city, depending on your relationship to that institution. Um, some of you may know that everywhere in New Haven, especially at that time, the legacy of brutalism loomed. It compounded the gashes of the highways and the wide streets, that some of which were really sort of legacies of public transportation, of trolleys, but now are wide streets that really promote speed through the historically Black and brown neighborhoods in New Haven and repudiated the human scale of the city, of the neighborhoods, and even the warmth of the large green, which, although it's not altogether unproblematic, is also an invitation to community and to dissent, to public dissent. With the influx of funding to counteract the Great Recession, the city started to heal the design problems, right? They replaced these heavy school buildings that were built like forts with like arrow slits of windows with large open windows, beautiful beacons of education, and they talked about it that way. They started to human scale some of the throughways. They calmed traffic. They repurposed car lanes for bikes. And they really started to take a different view of what the built environment could mean for how we relate to each other. And I take that detour because I want to suggest that urban planners have a really unique role today in accounting for the conditions that exist for today's dystopia, while planning for the just and joyful future we deserve together. Um, so I want to define sort of what I'm looking to when I think about that just and joyful future. And I'm really setting my sights on a robust and reparative democracy. And by that, I mean a social relationship of mutuality reflected in our governance, our economy, and our culture that is not just a set of rules about the bureaucracy of voting, but an orientation to a process for making decisions together, knowing that there will be conflict and disagreement, as well as shared commitment to care for one another through that conflict, and acknowledging that conflict can result in harm, that there will likely be future harms as there are past harms. And so it contemplates in advance modes of repair. What Richard vividly described as feeling like we're living in a dystopia, and his words that it seems as if comfort is only available to us, or questioning whether comfort is only available to us at the expense of others' dignity and humanity. I mean, I think like we have to really recognize the obstacles of today and the legacies of yesterday. And so, there's toxic polarization, and the growing tolerance for violence and a shrinking appetite, frankly, for difference. Um, Increasing segregation and decreasing affordability, which creates a kind of hostility of the economy, the hangover that we're all feeling still from COVID, and the fact that during COVID, we ended up, people who could afford to ended up privatizing all kinds of things that had been social activities and social goods. So playgrounds moved into backyards, movies moved into living rooms, pools became kiddie pools, like coffees and drinks became things that you did maybe in your house. And folks who weren't able to do those things were sort of cut out of the opportunity to do them or shunned socially for doing them anyway in the public space. And it resulted, though, also in a set of redesigns for how we might interact that we're starting to phase out. So I'm thinking of the parking space restaurants and little sort of parking space pocket parks and things like that. And then certainly, the fact that the Surgeon General has pointed to the epidemic of loneliness, and the sort of retreat into virtual realities and discrete information bubbles, is sort of fueling that loneliness in part, and also fueling that sort of polarization from the top. And then there's so many climate disasters. We're sort of overrun with a kind of um, fight or flight all the time. Um, and so I think that, you know, those are some of the things that we're seeing socially, but they're also kind of legacy infrastructures that are being amped up. And so some of the spaces, and this is one of the things that is most notable in recent weeks, the infrastructure for surveillance, especially in some neighborhoods, but pretty universally right now, and where that goes, like who gets to control that surveillance and what it's for. And a kind of architecture of hostility. My kids often will just sort of look at benches when we go different places to note whether or not they have the armrests that keep people from being able to rest, at the same time that there's not public provision of enough housing, there's not enough affordable housing, and so forth. And so, as a person who is not a planner, an urban planner, but a person who has lived in urban spaces my entire life, I'm going to credential myself and say I grew up in post 1968 Washington, D.C. I moved to post 1994 Los Angeles. I moved to pre 2008 New York, and then to post 2008 New Haven. Um, I'm going to suggest there are some things, and I'm sure that some of them are already contemplated in the literature for urban planning. And so I'm asking your forbearance for these suggestions. I want to suggest that you, as urban planners, um, are meeting facilitators extraordinaire, that you create spaces where people gather or not, where they collaborate or not, where they get to one another or they don't. You use technical tools, you navigate complex bureaucracies, and ultimately you shape the human experience of a place such that people interact or they don't. You cue us to how we are supposed to interact with one another, who belongs and counts, where people should want to go, and what we can do there. And so, participatory processes for planning, bringing the range of stakeholders, whether they're residents or visitors, businesses, commuters, into the process, and then leveraging your expertise in their interest is a critical aspect of planning for the beautiful future. But I also want to implore you to anchor to that beautiful future with me in that robust and reparative democracy, that social relationship of mutuality. So, what kinds of opportunities are there for people across all kinds of divisions to meet and see each other, to interact and to help each other and to get to know one another? Are there moments in each neighborhood for that kind of interaction? And are there ways to ensure that incumbent residents are going to be able to stay to enjoy those moments, not just steward the space, watch those start to take shape and then be pushed out? And an orientation to a process for making decisions together, knowing there's going to be conflict and disagreement, as well as a shared commitment for care. And that's an agitation to reframe kind of the wish of the season, right? What does it mean for there to be peace on earth? Like, what would it look like for us to plan for that peace to include conflict and friction, and for that to not be destructive conflict? I mean, the green to me is like this amazing example. In New Haven, it's actually owned by a private corporation of the 9 families who owned it at the founding of the city, which is crazy and terrible. And it is functionally public space that is used for amazing festivals and protests, that is a shanty town sometimes in times when there's real economic struggle, but also is a place that you just walk through and you can meet up and you can just sort of like enjoy green in the middle of the city? So how do we plan to navigate these spaces together? And One of the things that I think is there a way to build more friction that we navigate together? So there's this one intersection in New Haven that seems like it's been overlooked. And for the entire time that I've lived here, there's not a stop sign, there's not a light. There's like this you just have to look and see who's coming and decide if you're entering the intersection. And the thing is, it works. There's not been an accident there. It's like crazy. And like, I'm not saying that there should be no lights, there should be no signs, but like, are there places where we're building in social interaction instead of trying to control and manage it? Um, so I just am really thrilled to have this time together and to really implore you to understand where we're at. I think that it's a right assessment that we're sort of in a dystopia and to plan forward to the place that we mean to be and anchor ourselves there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Connie, for that. I loved the planning for the beautiful future. Thank you. I think when I came up with the title for the dystopic futures, I was in my pessimist, nihilist moment, which I think I've become more the older I'm getting. And I love this notion of the design that we as planners design the human experience of place. It's been hard for me to make the connection of why I'm a social worker and an urban planner and the role of social work in urban planning. And when I think about it, I now say that what my job is to be a social system designer. That's what we do as planners, and we have just given too much overvalue to the built environment, but forgot the lived and the felt environment, and that's sort of where the social work in me comes in. But we'll get into that conversation. I want to introduce next to our next speaker, Rachel Hatch. Rachel serves as Chief Operating Officer of Institute for the Future, whose mission is to help organizations, communities, and leaders become future ready. Community-based foresight is a passion area for Rachel, including current research on how people living with low income are facing climate futures first as an input to the state's fifth climate assessment. In 2024, Rachel has launched Institute for the Future's Future Ready Regions Fellowship Program and has recently led the projects on the future of affordable housing with Neighbor Works, Future of Land Use with 1,000 Friends of Oregon, and Future of Community Colleges with Frederick Community College. Rachel chairs the Board of Trustees for California Humanities and holds master's degrees from Trinity College, Dublin, and Yale Divinity School with the BA from St. Olaf College. Wait, you went to St. Olaf, Rachel?
Oh, you know it.
Oh my God, Umyaya.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What? Wait, I
We
just
talk
found.
later. We'll talk later.
We'll talk later. But what? Okay, funny, hilarious. Minnesota. Okay, Rachel, take it away.
Oh, so good to be with you. And thank you, Richard, for that framing when you just starkly noted we're already living in a dystopia. And what it brought up for me was this saying that I'm sure Connie and others on the call are familiar with by William Gibson, who's a science fiction writer who says, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And so I would say, we might be living in dystopias, and others of us are not even glimpsing that there are dystopias that we're living in. Yes, John, shout out to Neuromancer. So that's what came up for me when you noted that. And I think part of the practice of becoming more future ready, including for dystopian futures, is for scanning, which futures are playing out in which places, and to try to understand what are those signals of change, those early indicators of future directions of change? Richard, you said at the start, for those who are urban planners and other, urban planning interested people in this conversation, we have to find ways to stay sane. And for me, a way that I try to stay sane is by looking for signals of change, whether I like the direction of change or not, and turning to the person next to me and saying, "Did you see that? That feels different. That my jaw dropped when I saw that." So that's a practice I would just offer to all of you, maybe as a way to stay sane. But how I really wanted to begin this conversation is actually invoking. I was in DC earlier this year and again last week, so I've gotten to visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture a couple times now. And some of you have likely been there and seen towards the very top floor, the Afrofuturist exhibit, in which Octavia Butler, Natasha Womack, and others are featured. And I just wanted to start with Octavia Butler because when we're talking about dystopian futures and we're trying to be somewhat hopeful and have a sense of agency, I think her words are very grounding. Just one excerpt, it could have been any, she notes the very act of trying to look ahead, to discern possibilities and to offer warnings is in itself an act of hope. So I feel like you all from the Other and Belonging Institute have called us together into an act of hope. We want to talk about warnings and the dystopian realities that we're seeing unfold. And also what's changing, what are the possibilities that start to come into our peripheral vision around the edges at a time such as this. So quick background on Institute for the Future. We have a mission that you read earlier, Richard, which is to help organizations, communities, and leaders become future ready. And we've been doing that since 1968. We typically focus on the 10-year time horizon. That's a sweet spot in our work. It's far enough out that when you think about any field, urban planning, retail, governance, a lot can change in 10 years, but there's also some evidence that we can draw from when we try to anticipate how it will unfold. So that's the core of our practice. And I think it's important, especially for any group of futurists who are based in California. I know we have people all around the world on this call, to note that when we practice futurism, it's really about strategic foresight. It's not about predicting the future. We don't think anyone can predict the future with, point degree of accuracy. It's rather about trying to get ready for a wider array of potential futures, cultivating mindsets of future readiness, and ultimately to help us make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, because that's the reality we all have to deal with on a daily basis. So I want to share a visual that for me, I find myself in a board meeting, in a conversation with a neighbor or a relative at Thanksgiving. And this image helps me. So when I think about, tools that may be useful to the urban planning interested people on the line, this is one. And some of you have seen this. Joseph Burroughs originally came up with this cone of possibility, and there are multiple versions of it. Whenever we think about the future and how it will play out, whether it's a dystopian future, whether it's one we're hopeful about, we start with the past. And Connie, I appreciated how you named so many legacy systems of injustice that shape the past, where the past shapes New Haven, any of our communities. So we begin with hindsight, and that's a core discipline within strategic foresight. We come to the present, and then we have all these kind of baseline assumptions, this dotted line of how the future will play out. And the discipline of foresight is really about expanding the cone of possibility, thinking about what are plausible futures, what are the most probable futures within them, and then ultimately, what's a future I want to steer toward? What's the preferred future? So my offering to this group today is really around the value of alternative futures. And I'll go into it a little bit more, and then I want to share one example before I close, including a 2-minute quick video. So we all know that we have been living through some history-shaping events, future-shaping events. You can take the recent election outcome in the US that's been noted, let's call it event one. And in some sense, there's a feeling of before and after and stark contrast. And at the same time, with each of these events, there still exists a cone of possibility off of, that is shaped off of each of these events. So that gives me hope to think about the array of alternative scenarios that are still within our grasp. Every present, is informed by those significant events. There are lots of different methodologies that you could geek out on, and I'm seeing in the chat, some of you likely do this all the time around how to think about alternative scenarios. So here are just a few. The one I want to pause on today is alternative futures, which I think really maximizes diversity and difference. And one of the the really legends of alternative futures within the field of strategic foresight is Jim Dater. He's at the University of Hawaii's Center for Future Studies. I don't know how I missed going to, I went to St. Olaf, but I did not manage to go to the University of Hawaii Center for Future Studies. But he really, together with his students and learning community, noted that there is no single future out there that's to be predicted, but there are multiple alternative futures. And what you want to do is to try to pre-experience them to some degree. In those, in that, we typically use his framework that he generated by looking at, Richard, I'm thinking of your emphasis on art and culture also. He looked at all the stories we tell ourselves about the future and how it will play out. Science fiction, popular culture, narrative ecosystems online, the whole gamut. And they distilled into 4 different kind of archetypal ways of thinking about the future. A world of growth, a world of collapse, a world of constraint or discipline, and a world of transformation. And, you know, no matter who you are as an actor in the future, if you're a community college leader, if you're a city planner, if you're part of, you know, resist and build movements who are sitting across the table from city planners, wherever you are in that ecosystem, there are different actions that you would take to get ready for a world of growth, collapse, constraint, and transformation. And just to share one example to bring it down to earth and to this, you know, the topic at hand of urban planning. We've been really fortunate at Institute for the Future to get to partner recently with a group called 1,000 Friends of Oregon. And I know some of you are on the line, so shout out to those of you who are here. This is a nonprofit that is operating in a state that has a very unique land use system, as I know many of you who are urban planners on the line are well aware. Their mission is working with Oregonians to enhance our quality of life by building livable urban and rural communities, protecting family farms and forests, and conserving natural areas. So they are thinking about, you know, many different aspects of who we're planning for when we're planning. And we've been fortunate to get to partner with them over the course of the last 6 months, 9 months, as they're going through their strategic planning process to provoke their imagination about 4 alternative futures for land use. And so I just want to share the high-level context of that and the 2-minute video as provocation. And here's the link to the report that's forthcoming just later this week. So let me share. I know I need to share with sound. So let me make sure I do that so that we can watch this together. This is, again, high-level provocation, research-based provocation on 4 possible futures that would impact land use in Oregon.
Thousand Friends of Oregon invites you to stretch your imagination into the future. Insatiable. In 2035, we live in a distracted and dazzling world pushed to its limits. Desperation and distraction serves the autocrats and oligarchs in charge. In many regions around the U.S., pristine landscapes have been transformed into a patchwork of hyper-efficient urban centers and vast automated agricultural zones. Scratch. In 2035, Oregon, like much of the United States, lies nearly catatonic in the wake of cascading climate disasters and societal collapse. The erosion of governing institutions and leadership left society to survive on its own. No one is coming to help. Pruning. Governing institutions had been captured by corrupt elites in the late 2020s, and it took a series of political, economic, and environmental crises to converge before the will to accept a profoundly new paradigm was possible. Already used to a more heavy-handed government and reduction in basic freedoms, people embraced a new, necessary, and austere social contract that prioritizes sustainability and collective well-being over individual freedoms. In 2035, Oregon stands at the forefront of a world transformed by the seamless integration of human and multiple forms of artificial intelligence. The economic and political crises of the late 2020s obscured the incredible innovation happening in the private technology sector.
So you see here the question at the end is, how would you prepare for each of these alternative futures? I dropped the link in the chat for if you're interested in learning more about the research behind these scenarios or watching the full-length videos. They're on 1,000 Friends of Oregon's YouTube page, so that you can go take a look. And I'll end with this final statement. You know, these were 4 different alternative scenarios. We know that scenarios are tools. They're not answers. They're not, this is the prediction for the future. They're not the best case, you know, that it's not that there's one utopian world. In fact, when I was asked to join this panel about, you know, dystopian futures, what came to mind for me is that if you really dwell in each of those worlds, growth, collapse, constraint, transformation, there are dystopian aspects in all of them. They contain both winners and losers. In a world of collapse, we all know there are winners and losers in that. In a world of transformation, the same thing. They're not endorsements, you know, it's not that this is our polished future that we want to make happen, but it's really more of a provocation. And they're most useful when you don't argue with them. You know, things come up for us when we watch some of these provocations about the future, but they're most useful when we take them as a given and then think about them critically. You know, how would I prepare for this future? So I want to offer those to you and hand it back to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing that. There's so many things. I hope you're getting your questions ready. We have one more speaker, and then we'll come into a little roundtable conversation. That being said, I'm going to introduce our last speaker for the seminar and also for our series, Angela Brooks. Angela is the director of the Illinois Office of the Corporation for Supportive Housing. She currently serves on the Chicago Board of Zoning Appeals, the Illinois Affordable Housing Advisory Commission, and is co-chair of the National Housing Supply Accelerator, helping communities meet the housing needs of residents. Brooks is a native of Seattle and a graduate of Jackson State University, where she received her Bachelor of Arts in Urban Studies, and the University of New Orleans, where she received a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning. An active member of APA since graduate school, Brooks has held numerous leadership positions in the Housing and Community Development Division, Planning in the Black Community Division, Diversity Task Force, Washington chapter, and co-chair of the Housing Policy Guide. She is a member of AKA, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and the Links Incorporated, and also is the president of American Planners Association. With that, Angela.
Thank you, Richard. So I'm going to apologize in advance to everyone because my Zoom is on this screen and my camera's over here, and I forgot to move it while everybody was talking because they had me so engaged in their conversation. So first, thank you for having me. You know, I think the first time I popped on, I think Richard was probably like, I can't believe she's on here. And so I appreciate you for allowing me to join and participate in, you know, I don't know how I got to go last, Richard. What did I do to you that you made me go after these two? I'm really sitting here a little bit salty, but with that said, I am going to use slides because I'm really talkative and it's the only way I can ensure that I finish on time. So, you know, I'm going to kind of approach this from the perspective of the kinds of things that I think are really pressing global issues in urban planning that we didn't properly address and think about futurely. And it put us in the kinds of crisis that we're on. And those two issues, and you shouldn't be surprised hearing my background that I'm going to talk about housing a little bit. And I'm going to talk about it from the US perspective because I know those numbers. But over the last 2 years being president of the American Planning Association, I've traveled the globe, and it's been the issue that I've talked about the most globally. And what you see here, and I forgot again because I got so engaged in the previous presentations to swap it out, but the numbers aren't significantly different. They're actually a little bit worse, is a housing underproduction map in the United States. And the US is underproduced by about 4 million units. And it's pretty much causing some of the crisis that many of you have been mentioning in this chat, and the previous speakers have also referenced. And another issue that I think is very pressing for planners is the climate impacts, particularly around sea level rise and extreme heat. I went to school in New Orleans, which has all kinds of issues, as I'm sure all of you know, but certainly heat and sea level are huge ones. So as you can see here, this is a map of kind of the climate impacts and disasters throughout the country. Last month, I was in Cairo, Egypt for the World Urban Forum, and the two issues that were spoken about the most were both climate and lack of housing globally. And so, I think if we think about the types of things that planners impact heavily, these two would certainly be two of them. And I think last year was clocked as the 5th warmest year on record for the contiguous US, and about 28 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disaster events were identified. And, it's pretty much cost us about $100 billion, and a lot of it is due to planning or lack thereof. So I think as we start thinking about planning for the future, we definitely have to start thinking about the impacts on those two issues for a wide variety of reasons. But the two that are top of my mind are certainly around the equity issues, and the people that are most impacted by both are those who are the most vulnerable. And the work that I do every single day at the Corporation for Supportive Housing, CSH is a national nonprofit that does all things permanent supportive housing. So we do that in a few ways. We're a lender, so we do acquisition and pre-development loans to people developing permanent supportive housing. We do a lot of training around asset management, property management, and development of PSH. A lot of advocacy work. I think many of you are probably aware, Supreme Court decision recently that criminalizes homelessness. Many of you are in cities where you're seeing encampments swept up, homeless people being arrested, because that's very effective. Let's ticket and arrest people who have the least ability to pay or get out of jail. And that's growing. Who knows what's going to happen in January, but I'm pretty sure we can all guesstimate that's not going to get any better. So when I start thinking about the types of things that planning has an indirect and direct impact on, those are kind of the two that are on top of my mind. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit about what we should be paying attention to and prioritizing. So zoning reform is one of the things I've been talking about a lot for the last 2 years. And I think we have to think about the impacts of some of our planning decisions, and policies and zoning is one of them. And one of the things, and I know many of you are APA members, many of you aren't, many of you have some strong opinions about the American Planning Association, but one of the things that is huge for APA, and I'm not suggesting that our work is done, this is just the tip of the iceberg, we've got a lot to do, is acknowledging that zoning started as a tool of segregation and still perpetuates the tale of two cities, as many of us live in. I live on the south side of Chicago, in a very underserved community that's probably very close to gentrification and displacement, but not currently. But I deal with the tale of two cities every single day. And so I think as planners, we've got to start thinking about the past harms that our profession has done and what are the ways we can get out of that. And I think I use Minneapolis very often because 75% of this country is still zoned for single family zoning. And if you think about that particular type of housing type, there's this level of privilege that goes around that just because of a price point. And the reason it was created was to keep people who looked like my grandparents out of certain communities. And that still reflects in a lot of our cities today. And so Minneapolis has been kind of the case in point of zoning reform. And this slide really just kind of shows you what's happened since they've started implementing their zoning reform. They've increased their housing supply. They've kind of contained their rent increases compared to the rest of their state, and they've decreased homelessness. And so as somebody who's originally from Seattle, I think about the city I grew up in and the city I visit when I go to see my family, and it's very, very different. And price points definitely contribute to that. And we know that restrictive policies have made it harder and more expensive to build new housing. And so there's not a one size fits all solution, but planners have to start being creative, and we have to look at the available options that are available to us between adaptive reuse, starting to look at our parking minimums, because we still have way too many jurisdictions doing 1-for-1 unit to car parking requirements, and really speeding up our permit processes. And, we're starting to see more and more support around kind of reimagining what our zoning policies and planning policies look like. And so this slide just really kind of shows you what the research Pew has been doing around some of these things. It's, the NIMBY movement are the NIMBYs. They're going to always show up. But as a sitting zoning commissioner, I'm starting to see more and more people who are pro a wider variety of diversity of housing options show up at our hearings too. And
I by no means think that the way we do hearings is equally effective, because sometimes my zoning board hearings are 12 hours and there's probably nothing you could be building that I care enough about that I'm going to sit at a hearing for 12 hours. Aside from that, we are starting to see very passionate individuals like many of you come and show up and speak about housing the homeless, housing the poor, and creating the different types of housing strategies that really can allow people from 0 AMI to 200 AMI live in our cities. Because ultimately, all of us, I like to think, if you're on this call, are passionate about creating communities that anyone who wants to live in them can live in them. And part of the reason that doesn't happen is a lot of the work some of us do. So another example of creating kind of resilient communities, and it's kind of fun to include a Florida one because people don't often think about Florida, but Jacksonville, Florida has really started taking the steps to start addressing some of the resiliency in their community. And it's the largest city by land area in the continental US. It's really looked at the development types and geography influence, neighborhood risk and vulnerability for hazards and flooding and extreme heat. I don't know if any of you have been to Jacksonville in the summer, but extreme heat is a huge issue. And it really gives them some targeted, scalable actions that you can kind of see here. And they were really looking at the science and the data around that. And they worked with community members. And I know a lot of you in the chat are talking about how do we uplift those individuals with lived experience, particularly when we start talking about indigenous lands and things of that nature. But for so long, planners and our profession has not done that. So they've done a decent enough job trying to really incorporate some of that lived experience into the work they're doing. And, we've got to start thinking about climate migration. Communities have to start thinking about the questions like, what are the business sectors or enterprises that are vulnerable to climate changes? We probably can guess who that's going to impact very heavily. Kind of what are the local infrastructures that are stressed by increased population due to climate migration? And we've got to start looking at staff capacity and skill capacity of staff to address some of these issues. And so when I think about that a lot, I think quite a bit as leading the American Planning Association. I think about what are the things that we should be offering to our members and to our planning community as a whole. And so thinking about futures literacy, I know depending on where you fall and when you might have gone to school formally or kind of age-wise, a lot of the futurist stuff is something old people like me don't always think about, but certainly something that younger generations and more progressive planners think about a lot. So just kind of providing a lot of literacy around that. And really looking at, we had Anne Rainey, who's a futurist, speak at the National Planning Conference, and the number of people who were it was one of our most downloaded sessions. And so it's kind of showing that, everything has happened fast. It'll never be slow again. So we have to start thinking about the future. And it really means we have to be looking at technology use. We have to start thinking about conflict management as we look at some of the more pressing issues like eliminating single family zoning. We know there's going to be a lot of challenges around that. So how do we manage conflict, but how do we also uplift the types of voices we're not always hearing? And so just a couple of things that we've got out there. For those of you who are not planning APA members, you may not be aware of this, but every year the APA does a trend report for planners. And the thing I kind of like about it is it talks about what are the things that we need to act upon now as a profession. What are the things we should prepare for? And what are the things we should be learning and watching? And those things can move very quickly because, it seems like it was just yesterday that ChatGPT and AI was a learn and watch. And now it's something that many of you are probably using for your presentations now. I uplift this because it's just really important to talk about the types of things that are available that APA is putting out that many of you could be benefiting from in the work that you're doing in your communities. And this is certainly one of them. And one of the ones that you can be using to give to staff members and community members to help them kind of figure out some of the challenges that you are addressing. Overall, I'm really excited to be here. Richard, I thank you for uplifting this space. Hopefully we can work on formalizing some things. I have to just kind of address an elephant in the room. And Richard and I got the opportunity to talk in person at the Aspen City Lab and kind of, the love and hate relationship that many of you have for the American Planning Association. And part of the reason I thought it was really important that I participate in these, both as a listener and ultimately a joiner today is to really kind of talk about this isn't your grandmother's APA and kind of address the resources and opportunities that the largest planning organization in the world can offer to people, and just kind of be a part of this newer movement to really address the types of inequities that we've seen in our profession, but also in this organization, and move forward together. So thank you for having me. I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Angela. I mean, again, like I mentioned to all of you all, y'all know I like to talk some shit. So I think it was the first seminar that I was like, I just talked some shit about APA in general and blatantly. And then Angela and I connected and we were like, but this is the bridging work that needs to happen. And so there is an alignment in the way that we're thinking about transforming changes, not only in practice, but also institutionally. So I'm super grateful, and for there to also continue to be another ongoing relationship. And just thinking again, I think all of us are just committed to the field, and there is, outside of the institutionality, girl, I love being a planner because I love my city. I love being from LA. I love being from South Central. So, I think that's really what brought me forward. Thank you to all the speakers. So now what we'll do, we're going to do a little roundtable conversation with Angela, myself, Rachel, and Connie. Get your questions ready. I have some questions ready, and I'm excited for us to dive deep. Again, thank you all for joining us for our last seminar. And one of the things that I'm sitting with, in many ways, right, this series is about reimagining urban planning, but also a lot of the things that you mentioned are about reimagining our relationship to one another, how we're relating in general. And to me, that begs the question of like what we're asking really essentially is for us to be critical of the social contracts of this world and how we reimagine new social contracts. I mean, part of the reason I talked about how we abandon care. And in the introductory dissent, just a little funny moment I wrote in that moment, and I was like, now we having a little Carrie Bradshaw moment. Shut up. But my question is, as we're thinking about rechanging some of these social contracts, what are some of the ones that feel most pressing to you? What are the social contracts that need to change, and in what ways?
So I'll start and I'll say I think that the your point about care feels to me like the crux of the work that I and others that I work with have been doing for a really long time around our governance, around our economy, around justice issues in general. And that feels to me like critical and totally decentered in our current social contract, and really like pushed onto, it's like externalized to all of us as individuals. And instead of imagining how we do this, the big thing together, how we make sure that we're taking care of each other and this sort of like mutuality. And then the other is this point about dissent and disagreement that there's I think in all kinds of spaces, and certainly in the public sphere, a kind of desire to get to agreement and like assent, and that there's a lot of discomfort around what it means to be in a deep conflict. And how do we maintain our relationships through that? And if we can't imagine that, then like I don't know how we do democracy. If we can't imagine that we are going to be in deep disagreement with people that and institutions even that we are in deep relationship with, it's, hard to see how we stay committed enough to each other that we are able to move together peaceably.
Anyone else want to add to that?
This is why I can't have the chat open. I was so busy in the chat. But no, I agree with Connie. I think, as we we're just at a pivotal point for the field, but really as communities. And I think, for many of us, we haven't been in denial because we have lived experience of the systemic barriers that have been to success in our communities. I grew up in Seattle, so it wasn't until I went to Jackson State that I really got a bird's eye view of like the real vast difference in the have and the have-nots and the lack of investment. I got to Mississippi in the early 90s, and my roommate's great aunt still didn't have indoor plumbing. And I was like, what do you mean? And I think about that, or, I think about the people shocked about the displacement of African American economic development through the US highway system. Like, they're like shocked. And, I think about the fact that my grandparents' house was taken from eminent domain in Monroe, Louisiana. And every time I drive over Monroe, Louisiana to Dallas from Jackson, I'm driving over what could have been my grandparents and my parents' house and how that changed the financial trajectory of my family. And so, I think what I am most excited about and most also concerned about moving forward is what we do with that. And I think all of you kind of referenced, and I think it's really important perspective is, and Connie, you really hit it. We've got to plan and make spaces for people to convene or not. And I think the or not is often the problem. We measure success on if it happens versus if we allow, provided the space. And, we've got to think about the changed behavior that comes from many decades of not being able to do so. I live across from Washington Park in Chicago, which was designed by the same person who designed Central Park. And it's probably one of the most underutilized great spaces or parks of possible. And I can't measure the success of it because it also hasn't been open and engaging. It's not always been the safest place. And so I can't say it's not a successful part because we haven't put the infrastructure in to support the types of things that would go there, nor have we put anything for people to go to other than some soccer fields. You know what I mean? So I think as a field and a profession, we've got to think about what the measurable results are. And I really am stealing your or not framework for how I phrase things. So thank you for that. And Joy. So.
And I'll just add, when I riff on social contract, a couple of things that I think we really need to rethink, and I'll drop the links in the chat just to keep it brief, but we really need to rethink the future of ownership and assets. And, when we consider all of these intersection points of our lives that get expressed through urban planning decisions and projects, so much of it has to do with the underlying assets that people have access to. So I just want to drop those couple of links in the chat with a little bit more about our work in those areas.
Can I say two other things? Sorry. One is I do feel like we're in a rupture moment, actually. Like what is coming up is not just sort of like a kind of like slight veering in one direction or the other. It's like a hard hairpin turn, actually, on the federal level. And the thing that I think that opens is an opportunity to think boldly and make really boldly different decisions in our places about how we want to be in reaction or in response to the kinds of cultural changes that are going to flow from the kinds of policy changes at the national level. And so I just want to invite that this could be a moment for bold action in cities and in states, because people have a way that we want to be with our neighbors, like truly with our neighbors, right? And so I want to urge people to sort of take a hold of that. And then the second is, I think that the piece that feels to me like easiest to kind of fall out when we start talking about what the planning is, and this may be because I'm not an urban planner, but I don't think it is the heart. So I'll say I'm from Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. very deliberately went toward high density, like residential areas from a low density short. It was a short city. It was very walkable. It was like whatever. Um, and I get it from all of the planning stuff. I get it. And the work wasn't done with incumbent residents so that our heart could meet the aspiration. And so, like, as we think about, I think this is like the future of ownership. I've been in a lot of conversations about like universal basic income and all the things. And like, there are, you know, as a descendant of people who were really prevented from building generational wealth, a descendant of people who had a certain kind of work required and a bunch of opportunities really barred, that there are ways that we talk about sometimes what we can provide now or what we should be reaching for that strip out what we've been trained to aspire to. And so I just want to say it's like the heart, and I haven't read your thing, so this isn't about what you just dropped. It's just, it's a piece that I feel like sometimes we rush ahead of where our folks are. And like, it is like heart work as well as like really analysis, you know?
100%. And thank you all for sharing what y'all shared. I think it's so important to think about. I mean, I always say, as I mentioned earlier, I think as I've been sitting with planning and social systems design, I always think a little bit about this. It's because I mean, I truly do believe that we, as like at the essence of who we are as organisms on this planet and the most randomness of things ever, the built environment is an extension of the collective conscious, you know? And the reason why we have what urban planning has done and the legacy of urban planning has been to tether that relationship. So there is no, I mean, why do you think we're in a climate catastrophe? If I truly believe that, you know, the built environment is an extension of who we are as organisms, then of course this detachment has been there, then there is no sort of reliability or interdependence to the climate. So, you know, when we think about what urban planning means, I said before that to me, planning is really the restoration between a relationship of body and earth. And in our embodiment seminar, we talked about this notion of there needs to be an acceptance of conflict. Conflict exists in the natural world, right? And rather than thinking in somatics, we talk about conflict not from a destructive standpoint, but rather from a generative standpoint. The moment you, I mean, that's potential and kinetic energy, y'all. I mean, that conflict is so natural to who we are. So really embracing it and allowing it to be a part of how we mitigate that. That's why I think to what Angela said, that's why the or not is so powerful, because we have been so trained to think about the utility of space and not the possibility of space. That's a tweet, girl. That's a tweet, and it rhymed. I'm curious to think about as we're embarking and again thinking about the alternative futures. Rachel, I love how you presented that, right, as our need to pre-experience these alternative futures, right? And folks in the chat, please raise your hand if you have questions. This will be my last question, so I can make space for folks to ask questions. So please raise your hand so we can get a queue started. But just to kind of to wrap up my little rant, what do you think are some blind spots we should be mindful of, right? Like, what are some of the things? One of the things that we've been chatting internally, you know, I'm always trying to fight somebody. I think it's maybe because I was raised in the hood that I get an itch to fight something that I'm always trying to like fight. And I think Connie, you mentioned it. I'm like, okay, cool. If this administration's about to be audacious, so am I. Let's go. Let's plan some radical shit. But that also means that I have to be willing to transform myself and reject my own traumas. And so as we're thinking about building that muscle and that future sight literacy, what are some blind spots we should be mindful of? And then I see folks in the queue, so we'll get some questions from folks.
What's coming up for me, and I was thinking about Angela, when you shared about all of the climate work that is happening and the scale of those projects. But I feel like I shouldn't call it a blind spot. It's we're just not actually sinking into the realities, I think, of climate migration, in particular, the need to change building standards so we design for impermanence to a greater degree than we're doing now. The likelihood that we'll see within this decade people temporarily, many more people than already are temporarily relocating if they have the resources and privilege to do so. and just the strains that that will put on our infrastructure. There's a lot of conversation about it, but it feels like we're not sinking into that and looking at it with clear enough eyes.
What I'll do as we continue to think about that, I'll hold that question just to linger in the air. I want to get some folks in. I see Lynn, do you have a question? We'll go for you first.
Me? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so far for the amazing session. I'm having the time of my life. Um, Something that's really important to me, I typed it in a chat, but to me, it's vital to think about trust building because I'm calling in from Berlin, Germany. The German parliament and government has kind of like broken down, especially since like the EU election and stuff like that. So what I've seen like over the past few years is this corrosion of trust like in political institutions that then shape the lives and livelihoods of my communities. And so what I want to like focus on is because I can't change like the entire system, even though I want to like focus on what I can change, and that is like work within my communities to help them gain at least trust in each other, so that they can move forward together. Um, and that's where I kind of feel like that is still a blind spot in terms of like urban planning. Also, what Rachel just mentioned in terms of like climate change and migration. Like feeling like my communities, disabled, queer, person of color, are being thought into the urban planning instead of being an afterthought of it all.
Thank you for that, Lynn. I'm going to take Cameron's question as well, and then we'll get to answer. To me, I think the central question is how do we centralize lived experiences rather than justify lived experiences in our planning processes? Cameron.
Sure, thank you. This has been incredible. I'm wondering if the panelists can share a little bit about some trends that you're seeing in the successful facilitation of tolerance. To me, as and I think a lot of us are really focused on building empathy and understanding, and I'm wondering if you've seen and can share any successes of tolerance of risk, tolerance of course conflict, or seceding power and influence. At least in my thought, I think that tolerance can be seen as like the verb of practicing many of the things that we're talking about today.
Thank you. So I think those are really two good questions, actually complementing one another, right? So this question of how do we centralize lived experiences as opposed to justifying them, and then in addition to that, are examples and where tolerance has actually been successful, and some of that care and that heart that Connie speaks to, right, has been successful. So with that, I'll open it to you all folks.
I can honestly say I cannot think of one, which is, I guess, a little bit depressing. But what I'll say, and I'm going to say this from not my APA president hat, but my zoning board commissioner hat, I'm starting to see, as I referenced, more people speak in support of things. And so in seeing that, I would like to think it's from a tolerance perspective or an acceptance of the need a little bit better. The work that I do at CSH, we spend a whole lot of time thinking about that and trying to implement systems or training folks to do it. But I don't know that I can think of a measurable example of where it's really working, sadly. Hopefully one of you has, Joy or Connie.
I'm gonna just hop on the same train, I think, and just say I do think that they're really related, and I think that the breakdown in trust, it actually brings me to what I was thinking of in terms of the blind spot. So One of the projects that we've been working on has been like, what is a destination kind of American identity? Where do we want to get that's outside of a relationship to white supremacy? So it's not white supremacist, but it's also not just resisting white supremacy without being ahistorical. And one of the things that that project really brought up for me was as we were getting some of the feedback from focus groups and things like that, I was like, but like one part of how I understand who I am in the United States is understand, as I said earlier, like understanding the harms that have come to my family and our resilience and that resistance. And in a time where that is not sort of stories that you can say, well, we've improved on that over time, but are like we're returning to some of the dynamics that led to exactly those things. There is a great vulnerability to even imagining putting that down as core, putting that hurt down as core to who we are. And if that's core to how we understand ourselves in relationship to each other, um, it also gets in the way of the trust that's necessary, the tolerance that's necessary, right? And so I think that it is like patient work. So the piece that I can say I have gotten clear on this year is we had done some work around the fractures that were happening within the progressive movement around the genocide in Gaza. And we kind of imagined it as like convening and like whatever, bringing people together across difference. And the way that it has ended up really looking has been like technical assistance. Like individual organizations have particular constituents or members. They have a particular distance that they're able to go in solidarity of folks. And that's not necessarily what's being asked of them. How can they articulate that solidarity in ways that are both consistent with who they are and meet the needs and really offer true solidarity? How do they understand when they're tripping certain wires around frameworks of anti-Semitism and frameworks of Islamophobia, and understand how anti-Semitism has been weaponized to silence folks. And so it actually, it's so weird. I mean, I don't know that this is getting at it, but it's like it's actually really slow work to build that trust and create that tolerance, which I do think we've done, but it's been in not at scale, as folks like to say. So
100%. I'm going to take these last three questions just so we can have that moment, and then I'll do some final closing thoughts. I'm going to take Lorenzo, please, if you can ask your question.
Hey, thank you. Very quick. This is a little bit orthogonal to what you've been talking about, but I think very relevant. I'm a professional working in electricity policy for the last 30 years. We have technologies today such that electricity can become a local business. The technologies are all very possible, and energy is one of the places where communities are tremendously vulnerable due to shutoffs, due to rising rates, due to wealth being sucked out to pay corporate shareholders and so on. I would like to explore ways to integrate energy planning into urban planning so that as planners start looking about the future and the well-being of their communities, they find ways to cultivate local businesses, local supply, local resources, and keep wealth in the community. And I put my email in the chat. I would love to follow up with anybody interested in pursuing this. Or if you have any comments now, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. Sarah, can you ask your question, please?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I guess my question is just as a mother, I'm very concerned and I want to be safe. But to those of us that live in rural communities who want to be bold and support moving forward towards a collective future, I'm finding major challenges in being heard by the majority of people that live here, that they don't even think there's an issue there's nothing that collectively is happening, and I'm just kind of running into consistent roadblocks of like, where do I even start and how do I proceed when the masses is just keeping their head in the sand.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And then I think we have room for Sabrina, if you can ask your question quickly, please, so we can put them all together.
It's sort of a question, but it builds on what we just heard about rural areas and things that are invisible. And I wanted to share a small success that the community I live in, Kelseyville, which was named after a mass murderer of Native Americans in the 19th century. There was a popular vote to change the name to Kanaktai, which is a traditional name, and the popular vote failed by 71% to whatever the rest of that is. But the county supervisors heard an argument, and this is one thing kind of an answer to the question and a question how we continue to tell the stories. Somebody came to the city council and people were saying the majority doesn't want this, and a person who is relatively conservative stood up and said, if we waited for the majority to vote for things, we'd still have slavery. Sometimes we just have to do the right thing. And I think putting ourselves into those public spaces helps make it visible, even if there wasn't a success that day, but there was, just the recommendation went up. It was because somebody was there to say that. And that's what we have to do. And I live in a rural area that's doing a lot of eye and ear closing as well. So I hear you.
Listen, that was okay, Sabrina. I'm gonna try to wrap up the questions and some of the things that I've heard. We talked a lot about incorporating doing that heart work, and I think to Sarah's point, sometimes the heart work is tedious. So how do we maintain and how do we keep, like Nipsey said, right? This is a marathon. So, girl, how do you run after to mile 22 when you've been tired after the first 21 miles, right? Like, how do you, what we call it, running and hitting the wall? A little bit of that. To Sabrina's point, listen, I mean, I said this before. I'm all about like, yes, let's do the work, but sometimes you just got to shut shit down. Sometimes you got to put that threshold and be like, no, this is not okay. So what is that threshold in which we have to just kind of do things that are right? I mean, again, and I truly believe this, I think that part of the reason why we are in this iteration of the universe, right, under this new administration is because they also said, fuck it, let's just shut it down. And in some way they did, so let's be real. And then to Lorenzo's question, which I think is a fun and interesting question, thinking about scale, how do we also think about energy and the need for also including I said this in other spaces, but what would happen if after Asheville, just thinking what would happen if the urban planner also became an emergency responder, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the built environment got destroyed and we have a relationship and are shepherding it. So why didn't we show up? And so thinking a little bit about infrastructure, thinking about the energy and utility and its role for planning and in scale, really, I think it's a question. That's a lot. So please pick your question and some closing thoughts, and then we'll close out from here. That was a lot. Sorry, y'all.
I'll go really quick. I think that this question of like how to maintain your own safety and also push for change that's not, I'm going to say popular, around you feels to me like really important. And I do wonder, I mean, one thought that I have is the scale of the intervention and whether there's slow work to do. The other is that there are crises all the time. And those crises are times when folks expect or want to be shown up for, and that the showing up presents an opportunity for making meaning together. To what Richard was just saying, it's like, yeah, what does it look like if we see ourselves as first responders for our neighbors? And how does that shift how far we're able to take a conversation in the future? So those were just two thoughts that occurred to me around this question about like balancing safety and unsafety.
Thank you. Rachel?
When you said, we need to shut things down sometimes for And I think that's so critical to then be able to get into an imagination space. We have to be in the high ceilinged room. And so just shutting down. And I offer a book by Jane McGonigal, my colleague, that's called Imaginable, for those of you who are trying to carve out that imagination space.
I think one, Connie, I need to get access to the sign you have on your window behind you, because like that's a really great reminder. But I think, protect your peace is a very important thing. But one of the things I try to do when I'm in spaces, particularly in meetings, like yesterday, I was at a homeless legislative breakfast, and there was a young woman sitting by herself, and I didn't know for sure, but I had a strong suspicion she was one of the persons with lived experience. And there's only 4 Black people in the room, so I would have gone to speak to her anyway, just for that reason. But I went and sat with her, and she was going to be one of the speakers sharing her story. And I didn't necessarily know she was speaking. I didn't necessarily know she didn't want to be by herself. But look around in the rooms that you're in and think about the people whose voices you haven't heard, and do what you can to encourage them. Because what I do know for sure is that young lady brought tears to my eyes and motivated me to do the work I do every day in a way that nothing else I've ever done could have. But she was scared to go up there, and she felt out of place because she was in a white space. She was probably considerably younger than anybody, and nobody, whoever brought her there, just left her to sit by herself. So I say that to say, just make sure you're being the opening and welcoming environment for others who don't have the strength, the education, or the background that you do, that might make you a little bit more comfortable to have a voice in those spaces. And I say that it's important to uplift them, because so often we try to be the voice for them, and she can tell a story way better than I can, because my lived experience is nowhere near hers. And it moved every politician in there. And I saw at least 5 of them going to offer her this, that, and the other that wouldn't have happened if I had been the speaker. And I put a note in there too that it's really important to note another one. This is just my plug for some of the organizations. We're leaving a very historic moment in the built environment where you had both the leaders of both AIA and APA be Black women. And we are still leading very, very, very dominant, white dominant, but probably maybe getting more equal on the gender base, but still very non-minority centric organizations. And so it's really important that you think about ways you can uplift and reach and worry about and support the pipeline of the people you don't normally see in those spaces, to ensure that pipeline is there in all organizations. And I know a lot of people are very anti-organization, but they do serve a purpose, and they're very, very important. And quite frankly, they have more influence on fields than anything else. And so it's important that we're present and we hold them accountable, and we do so by just not only our leadership, but also participating in their processes.
100%. Thank you, Angela, for that. I mean, like I mentioned in the beginning, right? The organizing contra, desde, sin el Estado, within, without, and against the state. But also know that my spirit will always be against the state. That's always my commitment. We just, code switch and finesse. That being said, thank you all so much for coming to our Reimagining Urban Planning series. With that, we conclude this year-long series. It's been an honor. Again, like we mentioned, this was, I don't even know, y'all. I mean, thank you. We did not imagine that first session that 1,200 of you all will be here, and that would be consistent, that we make impacts across the world. And all we can commit to is making a commitment to thinking about what we can do with this series. Clearly, there is a hunger. It's available online. All of our seminars are on YouTube, so you can rewatch them. There will be a reflection piece that I will write at some point early next year that will be sort of encompassing everything together. There's more to happen, and we send out a survey. We'll send it one more time, just getting feedback from folks to think about what the next iterations could look like. I don't know, y'all. We're here, but so thank you all so much.